Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for coming. And thanks, everybody online for, joining in online. Tonight, for the member series, we have Joseph Burkhart, who is recently finished his master's degree in archaeology here at UBC, and is also one of the longest, I think, serving greenies at this point. Which is great. And yeah, I think I won't give it too much more. Now I'm getting a feedback from my phone. Hang on a second. Yeah, I won't give any more intros. If you want to ask a question and you're online, please do it at slido.com and punch in that code or scan the QR code. And then we will also, for everybody here, we'll pass around the mic so people can hear. Okay, and Joseph can take it away.
Am I getting picked up on the mic? We're just going to assume that the answer is yes? Yeah. Sure. Gosh, a window into the past. Yep, good. All right, we're good to go. Okay, thanks everyone for coming to my talk today. I'm going to be telling you about research that I did as part of my master's thesis at the University of British Columbia here. And my project is going to be mostly about the Byrsa Hill, which is a site in Carthage that 2,000 years ago played a central role in the Roman colonization of the ancient city. And it's also, for the last 160 years, been central to Western colonial efforts to narrativize and reprise that colonization. This place is an excellent case study on how data management strategies can really subtly and profoundly affect how a site is interpreted in the archaeological community, and how such strategies can also shield problematic interpretations from critique. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with an introduction to archaeology as a discipline. There's probably a number of archaeologists, there might be, joining us on the live stream, but most of you here don't have a background in that, at least as far as I know. So I'm going to give a brief introduction, and then I'm going to talk about some of the data issues that are specific to this site. And after that, I'll start showing you how I designed a new way of working and structuring these data, and what that new way of working with the data can teach us about the site's development. I want to be very clear, this is now for the archaeologists that are listening, that I'm talking as someone who's trained in working with Mediterranean sites. So I'm going to say things about archaeology in general, and some of them apply pretty well outside of the Mediterranean, which is my area of focus. Some of them are not always one-to-one, so I just want to give that caveat. Before I do anything, I want to tell you that, as all of you here know, but as many of those joining us don't, that all of this research was done from my bedroom at Green College, which is located on the Vancouver campus of UBC. This place occupies the home of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people, which has been their home for many thousands of years. It was stolen from them, and its occupation and development by UBC continues to actively harm them. As a white settler and former student of UBC, I have been part of this occupation, and I've benefited from it. I want to make this acknowledgement for a few especially important reasons for this presentation. First, Carthage was the site of one of the most profound acts of colonial erasure in ancient North Africa. Full stop. Second, my analyses rely mostly on data collected by and for colonial researchers. Many of these people saw the Roman colonization of Carthage as the establishment of a beacon of civilization on the edge of a dark continent, and they considered themselves the rightful spiritual successors of that quest. Hello, and thank you for joining us. Finally, I'm using technical approaches that often were created for, and increasingly are instrumental to, the seizure of indigenous peoples' lands and the erasure of their ways of being and living in this world. I'm talking about digital cartography, geospatial analysis, and archaeological classification. These are all powerful tools that I think can be used for good causes, and I've tried hard to make this one of them. Okay, so before we do anything else, let's make a really important distinction for those of us who don't spend much time around archaeology. Archaeologists don't study dinosaurs. If you thought we did, it's okay. Most people do. It's all right. To distinguish here, paleontologists work with fossils, almost exclusively with fossils. It's basically, by definition, what they work with. Fossils can be anywhere from 10,000 to 3 billion years old. And while paleontology can involve humans, it doesn't usually. There are some parts of paleontology that do. Humans have been around longer than 10,000 years. Archaeologists work with all kinds of materials, literally all kinds of materials. We work with materials that have an age that's anywhere from present day to up to 3 million years old, which is obviously when you're dealing mostly with fossils or stone tools, so that sort of thing. I really mean zero. There's a team that's doing an archaeology of the International Space Station, which last I checked was still in orbit. And it's basically archaeology as a way to use old things or new things to understand how people act and why they do what they do. Those materials can extend to whole landscapes. This is a picture taken from the Great Mound State Park in Indiana, where I'm from. And it's got whole landforms that were made by the Adena culture. We often work with ceramics, sometimes with whole landforms made out of ceramics, as is the case with Monte Testaccio near Rome. And we work with things sometimes that are very small. So you can work with things that are as small as a few microns across, in the case of pollen grains, and things that are also quite small but not quite as small in the sense of carbonized seeds. So the key distinction here is that archaeologists are interested in culture, and paleontologists are interested in biology. Now, I expect you could probably guess how this could get a little messy if an archaeologist were to conflate culture with biology. So let's dig into that. Where did Western archaeology come from? It largely grew out of antiquarianism, which was mostly rich Europeans who had grown up learning about Latin and Greek, going to places they had read about in their Latin and Greek books, and hiring poor people to dig up buried treasure for them. That's how they thought of it. These were amateurs in the original sense of the word, in the sense of rich people who have the leisure to go do activities. That was the original sense. And they revered Greco-Roman art and architecture as aesthetic ideals. Above all else, they sought to collect inscriptions, find pottery, jewelry, and sculptures. And some examples of that are shown here, with some 18th century collection of ceramics on the left, and another 18th century excavation of a tomb on the right. So the motivation for collecting these things was more than just admiration and obsession with classical stuff. This was entitlement. This was all taking place, of course, in the shadow of the Renaissance, 1600s to the 1800s, and so most of these people have a very deeply internalized idea that they are the successors and heirs to the Romans and Greeks. Of course, the attitudes and worldviews underpinning antiquarianism were invariably racist. They idolized white, muscled European bodies that they saw in classical sculptures, and the stark, square, columnar architecture that they saw in classical ruins. Other art and architecture, and hence other non-Greco-Roman cultures, were inferior to them. Based on their collections of pottery and sculpture, they believed that the Roman and Greek societies went from archaic, primitive beginnings to unsurpassed technological peaks, only to decay due to decadent, mostly foreign influences. So a key piece here is that these beliefs were ahistorical. Roman and Greek sculptures were actually, generally, very colorful. They were painted. Would have liked to have some pictures of that on here, but I didn't quite have time. Their buildings were colorful too. The Romans did not think of themselves as a monolithic culture in the same way that antiquarians did. And the dissolution of classical Roman and Greek societies happened for reasons that were much more complex than just decadent foreign influence. This is really important. The way these people retrojected their own ideas about value and culture onto the ancient past had major implications for how the field of archaeology developed, and it continues down into today to reverberate all around us in the white polished marble of neoclassical buildings and sculptures, in the fascist iconography of alt-right media and memes, in the narratives that most of us learned in grade school about the spread of civilization, just to name a few things. So in the 1800s, archaeological research received twin injections of scientific authority and nationalistic urgency. Archaeology became increasingly professionalized from an institutional standpoint, not a methodological one, meaning archaeologist is a position now, but it involves using dynamite still to get to the interesting ruins. And around this same time, race science was really starting to coalesce around eugenics, statistics, and some early parts of physical anthropology. The philosophical impact, of course, is obvious. It's just a small jump. If you really believed that the Roman and Greek societies were aesthetically and technologically superior to everybody else, now you think that superiority is rooted in their biology. And of course, if some societies can be biologically superior to others, what does that mean about your society? This is one of the attempts that undergirds some of the first, this is one of the sentiments that undergirds some of the first attempts at archaeological theory, which saw the, what we saw before, which translated the artistic hierarchy and progression that we saw before into a societal hierarchy and progression, as I've highlighted around here. And this is where we start to get the idea of how societies progress from Stone Age to Bronze Age to Iron Age, etc. And of civilization as having started in the Near East, or Mesopotamia, the Levant, somewhere around there, and that spread outward from there. If you learned that civilization started in the land between the two rivers and had to sing songs about it, like I did in grade school, this is where that starts. So you can see where this is going, I think. In a world of societal hierarchy and progression, it becomes very important to justify your place in it, your borders, your power, your identity, based on your nation's relation to the greater powers that came before it, the Greeks and Romans. And so nations increasingly position themselves as the successors to the Greeks and the Romans. And this stretches on for a century or more. And they start to justify their colonization of Africa, of the Pacific, of North America, and so on, as basically following in the footsteps of or reprising the efforts of the Romans and Greeks to bear the torch of civilization to their savage neighbors. This retroactiveness, this tendency to project ideas about superiority from the present onto the past and then use the past to justify the present only gets stronger and stronger as nationalistic fervor builds towards the world wars. It's worth mentioning that in addition to these innovations in theory, archaeologists begin to use new methods and practices as well. They develop slightly more systematic ways of excavating, and they start to actually publish some things. This is because the purpose of digging things up to them is no longer just to appreciate and collect them, but really to argue with them. And these arguments no longer just matter to you and your other rich friends. Now you believe that they also matter for your entire society. These publications are generally amateurish, selective, very unscientific. I'll show you some examples later. But they do provide some of the first documentation we have of a lot of large and important sites. After the World Wars, archaeology as a field experienced a series of upheavals in theory. Basically the ways that archaeologists conceptualize culture. We good? Check my mic again. We're good? All good? Okay. I should mention also before I get carried away again, if you have questions or you want to interrupt me, please do. That's fine. Part of this is scripted and some of this is not, so I'm happy to take questions. Yes?
I'm glad you said that because I just had a question about, could you speak a little bit to that 1800s to 1900s period? Was there a relationship between anthropology and archaeology at all? Or was archaeology just sort of dominated by wealthier and amateurs doing their work and then sort of, I don't know, it seems like they would have some
Sure.
intersection.
The short answer is it's very complicated. There isn't a monolithic archaeology. In some languages it's called archaeology, and in some languages it's called something else, and some things that we consider archaeology now aren't given that name yet. There's a distinction between people who study prehistoric and, in their words, primitive societies, and people who study classical societies and the primitive peoples that they interacted with. And so there's complications developing around that. Anthropology, I think people talk about anthropology as having started in the 1700s in some ways. I don't know much about the history of anthropology, but I can tell you it's complicated, and what applies in one country doesn't necessarily apply in another. There's consolidation going on in the 1800s and early 1900s, but in many ways it's still very idiosyncratic from place to place in ways that actually sometimes carry on down to today. There's also some really interesting splits that happen between thinking of archaeology as a classical discipline and thinking of it as a scientific one, and those are rooted in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And that is a divide that's not just in terms of topic, but also in terms of place, because in the UK it goes a different way, and in Europe it goes a different way, and in the United States it goes a different way. So good question, yeah. And did that kind of get at what you were talking about? Okay. Any other questions before we keep going? No? Okay. Right, so these are, in terms of theory basically just refers to the ways that archaeologists define or conceptualize culture, and how different they think about how different cultures interact, and how they change over time, and how we should investigate those things. The important thing about all this basically is that the overtly racist hierarchical views of human history and progression generally become no longer accepted in mainstream discourse. So in some places there's still a lot of othering and really reductive, implicitly racist ideas about cultural exchange, but on the whole the grand narratives of human progress are gone, or they're banished to fringe scholarship. From a method standpoint, this is where things start to become much more systematic, with people collecting data from a lot more materials. This is the point where we start to see an explosion in things that people are analyzing. Ancient DNA, pollen, tree rings, ceramics, chemical isotopes. It gets very complicated and very exciting. It's also where we start to see a more context-based approach to excavation, which means basically people excavate a site in pieces rather than all at once, and then they keep the things that came out of a piece together, and they separate them from the things that came out of another piece. This probably sounds very simple, but it actually really took this long. All of this means that archaeologists are generally starting to make better arguments because they're trying not to be racist, most of them, and they have more information to build their arguments with. But there's a downside. If you want to collect data from all of these different sources with a high degree of accuracy and precision, you're going to have to get other specialists to collect it, and you're going to have to get them to give it to you in a way you can understand. And then once you've got all of it, you're going to have to figure out how to publish it. And it's going to take you a whole lot longer than it took the people several generations before you. This is the point where it starts to routinely take archaeologists 5, 10, 20, 40 years to publish a final site report after the excavation has finished. Shown here is a example for some Israeli archaeology that's taken from a publication in 1996. And I think the shading's clear enough you can see what the trend is. Yeah. One important thing that's been missing so far is I haven't said anything about how local stakeholders fit into all of this. What about the people who actually live there, who actually live maybe on top of or even in the site you're interested in? By and large, I would say this is one of the places where there's little improvement. It depends a bit on where you're talking about and who you're talking about and what discipline you're talking about. But for the most part, I would say archaeological excavations still today continue to be largely extractive. First in materials, and then when laws catch up with that, with analog and digital data. All of these problems are particularly persistent in classical archaeology, which tends to be more conservative in theory and practice. So we're running a little bit behind, so I'm going to rush on this a little bit. But it's worth mentioning a bit about what a modern archaeological publication and research looks like. I've included some examples of publications from the 60s up through, I think, 2011 on the table. So if you want to come up and look at them afterwards to see what this looks like, you're welcome to. But in general, the way this looks is very similar in some ways to the way that labor was structured 100 years ago. There's a site director. There's someone in charge, one person, sometimes two or three. And they're going to be coordinating specialists and junior researchers. By junior researchers, I usually mean students. Not always, but often. Because the dominant way that people get funding for their excavations and the dominant way that people get labor to do their excavations is through field school programs with universities or equivalent. Publication, as I mentioned before, generally takes a long time. Usually it's done in preliminary reports or very brief articles about specific details of an excavation, and then full publication is delayed until someone can produce a printed monograph, which, as you all know, but some of those joining us might not, means a book with one author, because that's how you should do it. Different from the sciences is that creating the data that are used in the publication does not warrant authorship. It warrants acknowledgement. And this is, of course, very expensive. So let's talk about the site. I've talked enough about background. Let's talk about the site. So we're looking at the Byrsa Hill, which is in Carthage, which is in Tunisia. Tunisia is, laser pointer, right here. Carthage is a city that was founded by Phoenicians who started out around here in 1200 BC, and by 800 or 500 BC, by 500 BC, they had spread basically across most of the rest of the Mediterranean. They had cities everywhere. They traded with almost everyone. They went everywhere. They founded cities in the Atlantic. It was amazing. And around the 800s BC, they founded a city called Carthage here. And Carthage has a long and useful and interesting history that I'm going to skim over in the interest of time. They fought a series of wars with Rome. Rome, of course, is right here. And the third of those wars ended in 146 BC with the destruction of Carthage and the mass enslavement of its inhabitants at the hands of the Roman army. About 100 years later, the Romans returned, basically at the dawn of their empire, and they founded a colony on the bones of that ruined city. And they named it Colonia Julia Carthago. Turn off the laser pointer. Oops. So shown here is a schematic model of that colony in red, overlaid on some of the known remains of the original Punic city in blue. Right here. The Roman colony followed a rigid grid model that paid no attention at all to the natural topography of the area. And at the center of the grid, right here, is the Byrsa Hill, which was the organizational nexus of the colony as it was laid out. This hill had served as the physical, cultural, and historical nucleus of the Punic city, and it had originally housed the Punic Acropolis. Excavations on this hill have shown that during the colony's foundation, the Romans radically reshaped it into a monumental complex. As shown in this artist's rendition, the Roman colonists cut off its top and piled huge drifts of dirt and debris all along its edges to create a vast rectangular platform where they eventually placed their key monuments and civic and religious buildings. I was originally interested in modeling the labor of that. How many people did it take? How long? What would they have seen? What would they have done? But I ran into some problems because of the state of the published data on site. The site had a long and important history of occupation after the Romans, including occupation by various Byzantine, Vandal, and Islamic groups for more than 1,000 years. And it was probably semi-continuously occupied up straight through the 1800s when it was sold to France by the Bey of Tunis, at the time Al-Hussein II Ibn Mahmud. I couldn't find a picture of him, but I wanted to put a picture up. This is his son, his oldest son, Mohammed. And after that, the French start to construct things on site. They put a chapel dedicated to St. Louis. I think King Louis XI, I want to say, was who it was for, who supposedly died in the Crusades there. And they established an ecclesiastical order, the White Fathers, which really in many ways takes ownership of the site and starts to buy up land around it and conduct excavations on it. The picture grows more complicated when France conquers Tunisia in a brief but brutal war in 1881. There's more construction that takes place, and it's only in 1956 that Tunisia gains independence. And even after that, the site of the Byrsa is tied to France in many ways. I don't have time to do this now, but if we do have time at the end, I would be happy to click on this dot here, which will take us to the site, and I can show you on Google Street View what it looks like, because someone on Google Street View walked through the whole place. Okay. The excavation history of the site in those 160 years that it was owned by the French is very long and complicated. It could easily occupy this whole presentation. There have been dozens of project directors, most of whom are on this slide, and most of the researchers in the top row, and some of those on the bottom. Most of those in the top row and some of those on the bottom, the main goal of the excavation was basically just to find epigraphy or Punic tombs that they could take pictures of skeletons in and analyze their funerary goods. There's definitely some jingoism there. None of those in the top row excavated or published together. They all did different areas. They all did different publications. And while all of the bottom row was under the organization of the French mission, the same was basically true of them too. All of the primary site publications, including those that are most recent, are preliminary. And so they follow wildly different standards for data quality and completeness. I focused in this project mostly on the publications from the French mission, these ones shown here, because the previous maps tended to be less accurate. Which leads me to some of the problems that I had to grapple with as I was starting to work with data from this site. And that's what I'm going to talk about now. So some of the problems were problems of accuracy. These are the two oldest maps of the site that I was able to find. We're going to zoom in and enhance. So here's a map drawn very much by Bolet, who was the first excavator on site. I say excavator, I don't know if he actually did any of the digging himself. He certainly hired a lot of local people to do it. He did probably set up the dynamite himself. As you can see, just from the style of it, it kind of looks much more like a mined map than a cartographic map, and indeed it is. There's no consistent scale. There's no coordinates. A lot of the things that he draws here we can't actually find. Most of them we can, but a lot of them we actually can't. And it's not clear exactly where they were. The next map that we have, that I was able to find at least, is from Delattre, and it wasn't drawn by him, it was drawn by an architect. I think it was Bonnet-Labranche, maybe? And this looks much more accurate, and it is more accurate than Bolet's. But if you actually overlay it on other maps that are published later from the site, it has major gaps, and so I was not able to use this either. But it certainly looks accurate, doesn't it? There's a key theme here throughout this presentation of what does the way that you illustrate your data and present your data say about the authority of it. Maps tend to be very authoritative, and this one certainly looks like it is, but it really isn't. Okay, there were some other more subtle issues. This is a map from a 1980 publication, much more recent, much more accurate, looks great, looks very useful. And this is showing the southwest corner of the site where there's like a temple complex right here and some apses that supported the wall right here. There's one issue though with this. There's grid lines here that are drawn over the top of it, and this is a reference grid that was used by the excavators. I wonder if anyone can spot the issue here. Does anyone have any ideas? Yeah. Huh? What about the grid? Yeah. Those are. Sure. Oh, yes, yes. So his suggestion was that the grid is not aligned properly. And indeed, it's not square. Uh-oh. Oh, no. It's pandemic. It's fall of 2020. I am stuck in my bedroom. I don't have access to archives and physical maps. I am stuck with whatever I can find online, and this is it. Oh, no. I was actually, several months later, able to get a physical copy, and they're square. What gives? The way that this repository, Byrsa, which is the largest open publishing repository in French ever, the way they digitized these sources introduced some warping into them. It goes for other sources too, yeah.
The problem is not that it wasn't aligned with the grid, the monuments.
Oh, the monuments were
Because
aligned.
that seemed weird, yes.
I see. So the issue is not that the monuments are somehow, like the grid itself has been translated in some direction improperly. That's not the problem. The problem is that the grid is not a grid.
Aha.
It is lines that are parallel to one another, but not perpendicular to the other ones. That makes sense.
Yeah.
They're not square. These are supposed to be squares. They're supposed to be 20 meters by 20 meters. It's all supposed to be good. It's not. And this carries on, but thank you, this carries on into other sources. Those aren't square. Now they are, when I scanned it. So that introduced some problems that I had to deal with. I had to figure out how to de-warp those sources, and I did. I won't talk about how, but you can ask me about how later if you want. Another set of problems is around geolocation. So I mentioned there's a reference grid. The reference grid is supposed to be how you line maps up with one another. They never published the whole thing. This is the largest amount that they published, or that's a white lie. There are other ones that cover more, but they're more stylized, and so they look less accurate. This is the largest accurate looking publication. There's a lot of this site that's missing. What about this stuff? And in fact, you know, there's supposed to be a minor grid inside of the 20 by 20 meter cells. There's supposed to be a grid of 4 by 4 5 meter cells. How do we do that? You can see that's illustrated on this map here in the bottom right corner. There were issues of consistency. So in this map shown here, which looks, I think, very trustworthy, very, very good, we see a number of walls that are running perpendicular to the south side of the slope, or south side of the complex down there. There's walls up there. And one of them, wall G, if we zoom out, is shown completely here. If we look at another map of the site that looks closer to a photograph almost, that's that wall. Where's the rest of it? It doesn't exist. This is a reconstruction. Does the map say that? No. So every single feature is like that. So you have to figure out what actually is real and what's been reconstructed. And these problems of consistency can get perpetuated for decades without being questioned. So shown here is a map from a 1983 article which seems to present this map as an original figure, even if the scanning is not the best. And it's credited to an artist, Gerard Robin. And shown here is the same map, but it's not presented as the same map. It's presented as a new map in a 1990 publication by Pierre Gros. And there's no attribution to the 1983 paper. It cites just after the plans of Robin, who's not an author. Here's another publication. This time it's a book chapter, and it claims to reproduce the 1990 map. But actually it's different. Can you spot some of the differences? I feel like we're playing a game. In this one, there's stuff down here. These are some of the Punic ruins, the Phoenician ruins. They're not there in that map. Actually, this map is more similar to this one, which is from 2011, which, again, doesn't cite any of the other maps. It's like this is a new map, but it does credit Robin and 2 other people. Not clear what they did. These maps are all definitely related to one another, but how? Which one's right? These are the sort of questions that I had to figure out. And in one respect, all of them are kind of wrong, because if you look in the bottom left corner here, you haven't seen the data set that I eventually made, and I'll show you that later. But in the course of making my data set, I found that this alignment of I think that's 13 apses down here, and there's 11 up here. Only 5 of those are actually real, and the rest are reconstructed. It's pretty clear that they were there, but they didn't find evidence of them. They didn't actually exist. So what do the dotted lines mean then? Because there's no dotted lines here. You can see where this is going. So this is a summary of the problems that I've been talking about here. And consequently, I decided that I needed to make a new data set of the structural features that had the following qualities. It needed to be backwards compatible so that other scholars could use it alongside previous data sets. It needed to be internally consistent so that there were no more contradictions like what I was talking about. It needed to be unambiguous, meaning that it was easy to refer to a specific feature, this wall right here, and you know what I'm talking about, rather than just saying, oh, well, part of this other wall. Well, which part? And then finally, it needed to be transparent so that it was easy to see where I sourced the data from and what assumptions I made in the process. The first 2 qualities were necessary to make it easy to use, and the second 2 to make it easy to critique. So I'm going to focus in the rest of this presentation on the first, the third, and the fourth ones. So the first phase for making that system was designing it. And I did that by creating a set of identifiers that basically linked everything together. So all of the maps and profiles that I used, and profiles are just like vertical drawings, are given a unique figure ID, which describes the source publication using a code that encodes the author and the year, and the person that digitized it, myself, Byrsa, Kerner, etc., and the page or subpage that contained it. There's a feature ID system then that encoded a feature's type, so its interpreted function, and its subtype, and that gave it a unique identifying number and encoded also whether it was unique, whether it was extant, reconstructed, or hypothesized. Meaning basically, yeah, Liz.
Could you just give a quick example of, for instance, what does the MU stand for and the AR stand for in terms of
sure.
What is an example of a type and subtype?
Excellent question. Yes, and that reminds me of something I forgot to mention. So MU stands for mur, wall. I used codes that were reflective of the French words since people almost only publish in French on this site. So an example so MU-FA0005E is the 5th wall that I traced that happens to be a facade wall, FA facade, and it's extant. It was really there. It's on a map. Yeah, does that answer your question? Great. If you want to know more about the types and subtypes, I can talk about them later. And then third, there's a grid ID system, which is what was used by the French mission. There's a major grid, 20 by 20 meters, that contains 16 5 by 5 meter squares. And the squares are named following this convention. So row is Roman numeral, column is letter. So these are the various data types and their associated metadata. The important thing to note here is that features have a source field which links them to the source figure. And I'm going to show you what I mean by that later. Basically, the main point is that the source and the description fields make all of this transparent. So here's a diagram of how this works. So features are linked to previous data through their source and location metadata. This ensures backwards compatibility, transparency, and sources can also link to the axes of reconstruction, which is basically shortcuts, the shorthand for this is an axis that we see in a map, a line of features or a line that is used to reconstruct features in a map. So that ensures more transparency. Axes can be based on previous figures, like I was saying. You see them in maps. And sometimes they can also be based on features themselves when I have to make some of the assumptions that are encoded in them. And then finally, profile IDs are linked to previous data through figure IDs. So through this system, I've theoretically achieved the objectives of backwards compatibility, transparency, and unambiguity. Did you have a question, Liz? Or? Okay. So the next step was to geolocate the previous data. And by geolocate, I basically mean take a map and figure out where in the coordinate system we use to describe the Earth's surface it is. This is something that whenever you get a map now, it's just like in the bottom right corner or whatever. It tells you what system it's using, and you can see along the edges, there's the zebra stripe border that tell you which coordinates are where. So I had to pick a base map, and I picked this one since it has the grid on it, and I had to geolocate it relative to buildings. So I looked at the footprint of the buildings on Google Earth for the cathedral, which is right here, and for the museum, which is right here. Then I had to reconstruct the grid. So I extended the vertical lines of that grid, and I added more verticals along the quadrant of the gap. And then I added horizontals, basically extending them again from the horizontal lines that you see in the map, and then added a few above and below at 20-meter increments. So as I mentioned before, each major grid cell has 16 minor cells inside it, and that's been published to an even lesser extent. There's about 4,000 of them, if you do the math. And so I didn't want to do all that myself. I wrote code to do it for me. And to name them for me so that you could extract the names of the cells onto the actual features later. And this was the minor grid. It's faint enough, I don't know if you can actually see it on the screen, but it's there. Yes, thank you. So based on these grids, I geolocated the extents of 49 published maps, and I've overlaid those on the base map here. So then I had to make the data, and I started basically just tracing as many features as I could find in the different maps that I georeferenced. There were a lot of them, and as you can see here, I've color-coded them and coded different, I color-coded them on the basis of their ontology, if they're real, or if they're maybe real, or if they're maybe real. I can make that definition more clear if you want later. I'm just speaking in general terms now for the sake of clarity. Yes, and these were the axes of reconstruction that I used. And again, if you want to see how those work, you can ask me about it at the end of the talk, and I'd be happy to show you more clearly. And then the various profile extents. And most of those profile extents, I had to georeference myself. They weren't on any maps, which was a fun puzzle. And so now I'm going to give an example of how this data system works. We're going to go quick because we're, I think, approaching 10 till. So we're going to zoom in on the southern side of the site, and I'm going to show you a wall right here, a piece of a wall. So this is wall MUSX0005R. And can everybody see that? It's kind of small. Well, I'll tell you anyways. So it has a metadata field source. And source contains information about where that feature came from, how I figured it out. And basically what it says is that, the first things it says is that it says B1P100A and B2J O10A, which are just two maps. So these are their extents. This says that this feature shows up in these two maps somehow, or it's related to them somehow. The second thing it says is that it's assumed that its north side is flush with axis AX022, which is this axis of reconstruction here. So if we go to the axis of reconstruction, it also has a description field, which makes it clear that it's derived from those same two maps. In fact, those two maps both show a dotted line where that axis is, showing that the excavators assumed that the wall continued along that line, but they didn't actually dig it up. And then I've also assumed that it terminates quite reasonably, I think, once it hits another feature, which is that one. So to continue through the source description, or through the source field here, it also says that it assumes that this feature is contiguous or abuts the following other wall features, and these are them right here. So that's a kind of brief illustration of how it works. This is all, of course, digital data, so I published it online openly with my thesis, and then I'm hoping to publish a paper that fixes some of the typos in this, and that actually makes it a publication with bigger maps and stuff. But that's currently under construction. So that was the data creation process. So I want to give a quick illustration of why this is useful. And again, I know that we're running a little short on time, but I think it's worth doing. So one of the big things that this reveals is that the southern side of the complex had a diversity of construction techniques employed on it. So if we zoom in here, you can see, so these are basically, let's put a laser pointer on. Oh no, there we go. Are you kidding me? I can't do the laser pointer while it's zoomed in? Why do me like this? Okay, that's fine. So on the left side there, these U-shaped things are apses, basically rooms that go like this that support things above and behind them. And you can see that the apses on the left side there look different from the apses immediately to their right, which look different from the apses immediately to their right, and immediately to their right. This probably sounds kind of simple, but it was impossible to see that from the previous data because that encompasses like 6 different publications or 5 or 6 different publications that span 150 years of excavation history, which is why it took like 15 pages to write up. The walls are thinner on the left than they are on the right. And of course, there's some difference in ontological category here, but all of these have some basis in reality. These ones, even though they're hypothetical, are based on measurements that were taken for those apses, but they were never put on a map. So you can see that there's a diversity of construction strategies employed. And this is something that was totally downplayed, in previous studies, which tended to just emphasize a single top-down consistent plan across the site. And this also suggests some new hypotheses are warranted about apses elsewhere on the site. And that's something that I'll talk about more if you have questions about, but I think it's worth fast forwarding to the end of the talk. So it's about the eastern apses. So you can ask me about that during the questions if you want. So the summary of this presentation is basically that our understanding of this site has been limited by problems inherent with the ways that archaeologists have traditionally collected, organized, and published their data on this site, but also much more broadly within the field. And in the context of just this project, I created an interlinked data system. It was designed to answer new questions of the site while still being compatible with what people had previously done. This system means that we can ask new questions, and it means that we can challenge what other people have done and show that their analyses really were based on data that were inadequately queried, that were inadequately interrogated, I think, in a lot of ways. So with that, I want to make sure that I acknowledge my examining committee, Dr. Kevin Fisher and Professor Kevin Fisher and Professor Matt McCarty, who were both quite helpful in bringing this to the final product. I received partial funding from SSHRC for some of the work I did for this, and then I received a whole heckin' lot of help from various librarians, both at UBC and in many other places, helping me to get copyright and permissions to reproduce figures, and there was a fair amount of GIS consulting at some stages of this project that went on as well. And these are almost all of my references, and with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Joseph. That was really, really interesting. I have 2 questions. One's kind of more like simple and one's more kind of a reflective one. So the first one is, I was wondering you mentioned on, you were kind of trying to figure out which was going to be your sort of baseline datum map, and you tied that to Google Earth imagery in some cases. So well, first of all, I feel your pain. I've spent like half of my life doing kind of similar things to this, so I'm super impressed, and this is the kind of stuff that I think is a huge contribution. So, like, kudos. But in my experience using Google Earth, I found that oftentimes there's like, especially in kind of remote areas or rural areas that aren't so heavily imaged, sometimes the Google Earth images themselves will be like slightly dislocated even from each other if you go back in the time slider. So I'm wondering if you had any issues with that. And the second one is more of a question on, I'm wondering how your own opinion of the science changed from the beginning of your master's to the end. Either the science of archaeology or just the specific science, like how you sort of perceived the science at this study site versus after.
So we'll take those questions one at a time. I probably am going to ask you to clarify some of the second one, but that's fine. So with regards to the first question, so this is an overlay of the features that I made on the imagery in Google Earth. You can see that from a very informal approximation, there seems to be decent overlap, or if you can't see it, you can take my word for it. On a less informal note, I can actually bring up my thesis and show you the figure that I used to justify this. The figures that I used to justify this. Come on. Here's the list of figures. So the first one, so I compared two different data sets. I was pretty limited in what I could do here because, again, of pandemic stuff. This is the important thing. So I compared OpenStreetMap data and Google Maps data, and I found Google Maps data tended to overlap better. And these were vectors that I got from Google Maps. I didn't trace them myself, I don't think. And while I agree that yes, using Google Earth as your reference data set can cause problems, the main goal that I had with this project was to make it internally consistent. If you have to translate it in one direction or another, big whoop, you can translate it. Okay, that's fine. But it really matters if something is scaled correctly. And so the goal was, the goal with making the base map relative to Google Earth data was basically get it close enough that it's good enough, and then make darn sure that it's scaled properly. So make sure that each of those cells is assumed to be exactly 20 by 20 meters. And that's how I did it. So it's certainly possible that I could be off by 1 meter or 2 meters. I did a comparison of the features that I got after the fact and compared them to the Google Earth imagery again, and there was never a divergence of more than 2 meters, which is well within Google Earth's tolerances, if you want to use that word. So that's that. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Great. That was the best I could do. Can you clarify your second question? So you're asking what my opinions are about?
I mean, I imagine you chose this study site for a reason. Like you were interested in it, and also like you had a sense of the science that had been done before. I don't know, maybe not. But I mean, from my own personal experience, having kind of done the sleuthing or like the real like deep dive into the metadata or lack of metadata, it starts to bring up questions in my mind about, like it's definitely changed my perception of like the scientists and like the kinds of, I don't want to,
sure.
You know, I was kind of want to more open-ended your own experiences, but yeah.
My research experience with this project is very unique and very not held, that was a word, by a lot of other archaeologists because I was confined only to data that had been published and republished online, which is a very heavy, very severe restriction, I think. And it's something I try to be cognizant of when I make comments about what I think about archaeology, because I have strong opinions, but they're derivative of this project. That said, one of the big takeaways I have is that I think archaeology as a field, a lot of archaeologists can't really decide if they want to be scientists or not, because I am a scientist. I have been a scientist. And part of what that means for me at a very basic level is if you make data, if you make representations of data that are used in a publication, you get authorship. And if you don't, that's abusive. And that's how it's talked about in a lot of different branches of science. But the thing that I saw in archaeology, and I'm not saying that archaeology is abusive in that way. I'm saying in science, that's how it works. In archaeology, I think the bigger issue is that if you don't make the representations of data that you publish with, you're not publishing the data that you did your analyses with, because you did your analyses before the publication. And this is in some ways less of a problem than it used to be, and in some ways it's just been kicked in a different direction because, you know, when you're looking at maps like, back all the way up, you know, if you're looking at maps like this, Grow couldn't have drawn that. I don't know him, but that's not what his training was in. His training didn't allow him to make that. Robin could. Robin definitely had the training for that. So there's very much an overlap between technical artists and technical illustrators in a lot of archaeological research. And so there becomes a split, a division of labor that occurs that separates the person who makes the data, because it is data, from the person who interprets it. And that, I think, is a very deep and real issue. And that's something that I feel very strongly about. It's one of the main reasons why I did so many different technical things with this project myself, because I wanted to learn how to do them myself. And it's a very old problem, and it's one that now almost all of the technical illustrations you see in a publication are done on computers. And some of them are done by the lead author, but many of them often are not. And so you see similar problems cropping up in that way. So that's one of the big opinions I have, I would say.
Thank
Great
you.
question. Yeah, Riku.
Hey, thank you for the great talk. I have two questions. I think you kind of answered the first question, but I will ask anyway. So you presented the problems about those maps and everything, and then you presented your solution in your thesis. And I was wondering, like, what is causing this, like these really interesting issues that my area of research doesn't necessarily see, in the sense of like this, like perpetuation of these issues. Like, I feel like, those issues are supposed to be resolved by now. That's how I felt about it. And of course, your work is amazing, but like your work was supposed to be done by now, in many different archaeological sites. That's what I felt. And I was wondering what exactly is causing these kind of issues, like long-standing issues. They're probably in so many sites. And my second question is a more general one. Like,
How about we do your first question first,
Yeah.
and then you ask your second question, because then I don't have to remember as much.
Sounds good.
So I'm going to give a response to it, and you tell me if it answers it or not, because I already
Sure.
have a response about something very similar to what you asked, and you can tell me if this kind of satisfies what you were talking about.
Sure.
So we're going to back up to a full sitemap here. Come on. There we go. So the first question that Riku asked was about, why, in some ways, why hasn't someone already, fixed these problems?
Yeah.
I would like to know too, and I have some ideas, but I had the same reaction over and over again during the 2,500 hours I spent on this project. Why didn't someone else do this before me? Because all of the main publications I used were published 50 years ago. And they've, as happens especially in non-science fields in academia, there's review after review after review of these books, and they don't bring up this issue. And the reason, I think, is that the people who write those reviews and even in some ways more important, the editors who are responsible for these publications aren't, the editors aren't the people who are often not the people who are going to use these books. And the reviewers often don't have the technical know-how to be able to interrogate the data this way. One of the things that I found and documented extensively in my thesis is that over and over again, I had to go not just the extra mile, but 15 extra miles to be able to see that there was a problem. I can show you, because it's something I like talking about. One of the examples of this, we'll go back up to this figure. Where is it? Oh, it's in the profiles. Summary map. Not that one. Yeah. Bring this over here. Zoom out a little bit. So these are two figures for my thesis. Over here is a map. And this map is purporting to show the, so you can see that zigzag dotted line a little bit. That's supposed to be the extents of this profile drawing on the right. So this is the vertical cross-section kind of. And one of the things I noticed when I was reading the book that this was taken from is that the grid cells didn't quite match. But I only knew that because I already knew what those grid cell IDs were. If you wanted to know that, you had to do the math yourself because there's no actual labels in there. And so you had to already reconstruct the entire major and minor grid yourself, and then you had to position that inside it. And there were shortcuts. You could try to figure it out from another map, and that would work to some extent. But if I recall, there isn't another map that actually overlaps completely with this one. And so you have to actually figure it out yourself. Once you do that, once you get those grid cell labels, which took me 4 weeks, if you measure with a ruler, you'll see that the labels up on the, if we zoom in on the one on the right here, you can see this thing is supposed to have H35 here. This is supposed to be a grid cell label that tells you what parts of the profile extent are in which grid cell. And most of them are totally wrong. They're not totally wrong. They're based in some reality, but it's not the reality that's shown on that map. And so I spent probably like 10 or 15 hours figuring out, based on the features that were in this profile, that you can see, some of which are labeled here. Those are labels that I put there, sorry. No, they weren't labeled. Based on those I had to figure out which feature was which, and then I had to figure out, measure with the ruler to figure out where the boundaries were, and then compare that to the map that I'd already made to figure out where, based on the features that I'd already traced, that thing was. And that told me that that was wrong. And that was like 30 or 40 hours of work for 2 figures in a 3-volume set. So you can't do that, right? That's a quality control, thing that has to be made at the publishing level or at the publishing stage, and it wasn't. And that's where a lot of the volume of my thesis came from, was identifying those problems and correcting them. Yeah, thank you. Great question. And you had a second one?
Yeah, the second question is a more general one. So, by the way, thank you for the great answer. That's exactly what I wanted to hear about. And my second question was, so I saw the links around the end of your presentation slides, like, you put the GitHub links and everything, right? Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if those, the codes or algorithms that you have created can be applicable to, for instance, doing a very similar work in other sites as well? Or is what you created very specific to this archaeological site you created?
Excellent question. I originally wanted to make tools that were, as part of this thesis, make like a plugin, basically, that would be widely applicable. I didn't have time to. But some of the tools that I did develop and that I totally skimmed over, I have backup slide that shows some of the code on the right there, and then some other of the code there. I've put together like a very informal kind of toolkit on GitHub that's another repo that people who are interested in can go to. I would like to make it into a plugin eventually, and some of the functions in it are definitely widely applicable because making an automatically making a grid, having a function that does that for you is very useful. And the function actually is more useful than you might think because it makes grids that accommodate distorted matrix grid cells because mine were distorted. And so that was a part of the project that I totally didn't talk about here because I had to do the math to figure out how to make an n by n grid that was linearly distorted and how to average it linearly across the cell. And that was fun. That was one of the most fun parts of this.
This is really cool. Thank you so much.
I want to make sure you guys get to ask your questions, but I also want to make sure people can go if they need to. So Mark had asked us to not go too late. So is it okay if we end it and then we can keep on asking questions of
Works
Joseph?
for me.
Yeah? Okay, great. Well, thanks so much, Joseph. And yeah, join us next week.